Humans do not actually fear failure. They are biologically terrified of absolute autonomy. Strip away the external directives. Erase the socially validated scripts. The average adult does not suddenly discover their true self. They experience a catastrophic neurological void. The brain registers this absence of instruction as an immediate survival threat. They will actively hunt down a new system of strict conformity. This is a desperate reflex to escape the agonizing burden of independent choice. Watch closely how they react. Two individuals sit on a couch in a dimly lit room. They are scrolling endlessly through a digital streaming interface. Person A asks a highly standard question. What do you want to watch? Notice the immediate physical shift in Person B. Their eyes rapidly dart between Person A's micro-expressions and the glowing screen. They are aggressively scanning for a safe social cue. Their breathing shallows into a highly restricted rhythm. Their spinal posture instantly rigidifies. Their vocal pitch raises to signal a state of non-threat. They deploy an automatic verbal shield. I don't know, what do you like? Or they retreat to a sitcom they have already consumed 5 separate times. They are physically incapable of asserting an independent preference. Their vocal cords will not engage without prior external validation. But here is the brutal physical reality. What exact physiological mechanism is triggering this real-time paralysis? Why does the human brain systematically erase its own neural identity? Why does it reconstruct its entire lifestyle architecture simply to mimic the person sitting at the adjacent desk? We frequently adopt highly destructive social behaviors. We engage in exhausting, high-friction evening rituals. This is not driven by genuine neurological reward. It has absolutely nothing to do with authentic pleasure. The actual fatal mechanism is a deep biological panic. We are aggressively neutralizing a psychological threat, the threat of out-group isolation. The human amygdala is a primitive, highly sensitive alarm system. It perceives social isolation as a literal physical survival threat. It equates standing apart from the crowd with imminent death. Failing to mirror the exact behavior of the immediate in-group triggers an alarm. If the herd participates in intensive, toxic nightlife, you must conform. Resistance triggers a chronic, agonizing release of cortisol. Adrenaline floods the central nervous system. The brain immediately prioritizes social cohesion over physical preservation. It forces the individual to ingest biological toxins like alcohol. It commands the body to endure severe, damaging sleep deprivation. This self-destruction serves one singular, desperate purpose. It artificially downregulates the paralyzing anxiety of being left behind. But here is the brutal physical reality. This survival strategy demands chronic exposure to hyperstimulation. The environment requires deafening acoustics and aggressively pulsing lights. It mandates the continuous, heavy consumption of ethanol. This artificial environment violently spikes extracellular dopamine levels. The neurochemical flood completely overwhelms the system. To maintain basic biological homeostasis, the brain takes defensive action. It rapidly and aggressively downregulates its own D2 dopamine receptors. This creates a devastating permanent baseline state. Outside of the highly stimulating herd environment, the individual experiences chemical anhedonia. Total emotional numbness becomes the default waking state. The organism becomes completely lethargic in isolation. They are now strictly dependent on the loud toxic group for basic neurochemical function. Watch close how they react. An individual sits at a high-volume bar on a Friday night. Their masseter jaw muscles are visibly tightly clenched. Their ocular gaze is completely unfocused and blank. They stare numbly at the condensation dripping down their glass. Their left hand is concealed under the wooden table. They are silently, repeatedly checking the digital clock on their phone. The exact millisecond a dominant colleague glances in their direction, everything changes. Their zygomatic major muscle instantly and violently contracts. It forms a forced, unnaturally wide smile. They manually hoist their heavy glass into the air for a toast. They physically swallow and suppress an active yawn. They will mask their profound exhaustion to signal flawless group alignment. The physical organism cannot sustain this prolonged charade. This leads to severe, undeniable physiological degradation. Visceral fat accumulation becomes highly measurable. A chronic, impenetrable cognitive fog settles over the brain. The prefrontal cortex begins to physically erode under the stress. This is the exact region responsible for executive function. The neurological ability to plan and execute complex tasks breaks down entirely. This leads directly to measurable, catastrophic declines in analytical performance, and it gets worse. The hedonistic framework inevitably causes a systemic biological collapse. The body simply gives out. But the traumatized brain does not suddenly revert to independence. It does not suddenly embrace healthy autonomy. Instead, it panics. It frantically scans the environment for a new master. It desperately searches for a socially acceptable framework of absolute compliance. It needs a new rigid system to dictate its every move. Hyperdiscipline is not a sign of absolute mental fortitude. Obsessive self-improvement metrics are highly weaponized avoidance mechanisms. They are deployed to completely suppress latent existential anxiety. The brain uses them to permanently shut down the need for self-reflection. The actual fatal mechanism lies in prefrontal overdrive. The individual obsessively tracks physical biometrics. They monitor sleep scores and heart rate variability with clinical paranoia. They execute rigorous, unyielding exercise schedules. This forces the prefrontal cortex into a state of continuous hyper-vigilance. The brain is locked into endless, high-stakes task management. This state of constant optimization serves a highly specific physiological purpose. It deliberately and aggressively suppresses the default mode network. The DMN is the primary neural pathway for self-referential thought. It controls autobiographical memory and the biological function of daydreaming. By staying perpetually optimized, the neural network blocks these signals entirely. The brain successfully avoids processing its own massive emotional voids. Authentic human emotion is neurologically unpredictable. It carries a high risk of psychological destabilization. This volatile reality is aggressively replaced by deterministic data. Health algorithms offer absolute predictable mathematical certainty. Hitting a daily target triggers a calculated microdose of serotonin. This creates a devastating closed-loop behavioral addiction. The individual stops deriving value from their physical existence. They delegate their entire sense of self-worth to a silicon processor. The external algorithm becomes the absolute arbiter of reality. This successfully masks the complete absence of a core identity. It replaces human agency with a sterile illusion of control. Watch closely how they react in isolation. A digital alarm violently triggers at precisely 5 a.m. The individual does not pause to stretch their skeletal muscles. They do not open their eyes to observe the physical environment. Their immediate, reflexive motor action is extending their left arm. They instantly illuminate the screen of their biometric smartwatch. Their facial musculature remains completely flat and paralyzed. The expression registers zero biological joy or morning satisfaction. They simply stare at the glowing sleep score on the glass. They execute a brief, rigid nod of validation upon seeing a number above 85. They mechanically rotate their torso and place their feet on the floor. They stand up like a programmed automaton. They begin a silent, robotic walk toward a freezing cold water plunge. This results in the complete mechanization of the human organism. Subjective human value is reduced entirely to quantifiable data points. The psychological result is severe, permanent emotional blunting. The individual isolates themselves behind an impenetrable wall of metrics. They become completely severed from organic, unstructured human connection. And it gets worse. Even this impenetrable biometric fortress is highly conditional. The optimized machine is always waiting for a new set of instructions. When a higher hierarchical authority presents a conflicting set of rules, everything shifts. The machine instantly and brutally deletes its own code to adapt. In the presence of perceived hierarchical authority, individuals will spontaneously discard their established routines. They will instantly mimic the extreme behaviors of their superiors. They actively liquidate their personal identity to secure proximity to power. The actual fatal mechanism begins in the human mirror neuron system. These neural pathways do not merely copy physical gestures. They actively simulate the internal psychological states of perceived leaders. Place the individual in a high-stakes, corporate environment. The brain immediately identifies the dominant node in the social hierarchy. This triggers an unconscious, involuntary mimicry of the leader's specific traits. If the authority figure adopts severe hyper-isolation, the subordinate follows instantly. They adopt this extreme behavioral mode purely to signal in-group allegiance. It is a biological mechanism designed solely to secure physical and financial resources. This immediate obedience violently overrides their previous behavioral patterns. The brain intentionally restricts environmental stimuli to a highly extreme loop. The physical perimeter shrinks exclusively to work, the gym, and the home. This severe limitation serves to conserve glucose and reduce cognitive load. The prefrontal cortex deliberately narrows the individual's perceptual field. This prevents the conscious mind from recognizing objective, external reality. It completely blocks the processing of grief associated with a deteriorating personal life. The human organism utilizes intense workaholism as a potent clinical anesthetic. It chemically numbs the devastating reality of total social isolation. The individual functions in a state of permanent ego depletion. They lack the psychological energy to maintain any identity outside of strict productivity. Watch close how they react. An employee remains rigidly seated at their desk at 7:30 p.m. The sprawling open-plan office is entirely empty. A senior manager works silently in a glass office 30 feet away. The employee stares intensely at a dense, illuminated spreadsheet, but their physical hands are completely still on the keyboard. Their ocular blink rate is severely and unnaturally reduced. Their shoulders are hunched forward in a biological posture of submission. They are consciously delaying the physical action of packing their bag. They are waiting for a single acoustic cue. They must hear the mechanical click of the manager's door opening. Only then will they initiate their own synchronized exit sequence. This results in total, permanent psychosocial isolation. The biological consequence is a rapid atrophy of social faculties. The individual completely loses critical neural pathways over time. They physically cannot generate spontaneous, unscripted conversation. They lack the cognitive flexibility to navigate unstructured social environments. The neurological capacity to form organic romantic relationships is entirely destroyed. And it gets worse. This isolated, highly conditioned mind will eventually face an external trigger. It will be abruptly dragged back into a dynamic, unstructured social environment. The complete absence of an internal psychological compass is brutally exposed. Chronic behavioral mimicry does not just temporarily suppress your personality. It actively destroys your neurological infrastructure. It permanently erases the physical pathways required to make independent choices. This culminates in a state of absolute paralyzing existential dread. The actual fatal mechanism occurs deep within the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This specific brain region is crucial for processing personal preferences. It physically assigns subjective value and executes value-based decisions. But you have spent years continuously delegating these choices. You surrendered your autonomy to peers, algorithms, and corporate managers. This chronic neural neglect causes literal functional atrophy in the region. The formulation of an original, authentic opinion becomes a biological impossibility. The necessary neural hardware has completely degraded from disuse. But here is the brutal, physical reality. Claiming an authentic choice forces the human ego into a corner. It demands that you accept absolute, undeniable liability for the outcome. This generates a crushing, unbearable psychological weight. To avoid this dread, The individual initiates an extreme defense protocol. They spontaneously adopt the passive, inanimate role of an object. They biologically pretend they possess absolutely zero personal agency. They collapse entirely into a clinical, irreversible state of bad faith. Watch closely how they react in the wild. An individual is sitting quietly at a crowded, noisy bar. A stranger suddenly turns and asks a direct, open-ended philosophical question. What do you think? The individual's vocal cords visibly and immediately tighten. Their eyes dart rapidly back and forth between the stranger and their partner. They are desperately, actively scanning the environment for a safe social cue. Their mouth opens slightly. They produce a sharp, audible intake of air, but absolutely no words. Their physical body locks into an acute state of panic. Their fingers grip the edge of the wooden bar with maximum tension. They squeeze tightly enough to entirely drain the blood from their knuckles. This is the permanent loss of selfhood. The individual ceases to function as a subjective, conscious agent. They degrade into a purely reactive biological organism. They merely occupy physical space and consume oxygen. They automatically echo the preferences and neuroses of their environment. They exist only to absorb and reflect the demands of whoever stands closest. Human beings are not born with a concrete, immutable identity. There is no hidden self waiting to be peacefully discovered. The self is a biological callus. It is a psychological structure built exclusively through intense friction. It requires the repeated trauma of making autonomous, highly unpopular decisions. If you spend your life perpetually outsourcing your daily choices, if you surrender your agency to the chaotic nightlife crowd, if you bow to the rigid optimization algorithm or the corporate hierarchy, you do not simply lose your way. You physically fail to construct a self. You remain a completely empty biological vessel. You operate as a baseline stimulus response machine. You are entirely vulnerable to the ideology of the highest bidder. You belong entirely to whoever stands in closest physical proximity. But here is the brutal physical reality. You must deliberately engineer cognitive friction to rebuild your brain. You must physically force the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to regenerate. Start by enforcing one non-negotiable action every single day. It must be entirely unoptimized and completely socially useless. It must be generated exclusively from internal spontaneous curiosity. Do it not for cardiovascular health. Do it not for strategic corporate networking. Do it not for digital productivity tracking. When you are asked for your preference in any social setting, you must enforce a mandatory, physical, 3-second pause. Do not allow your vocal cords to immediately engage. You must actively consult your own internal biological state. Stop scanning the room for the socially correct answer. The correct answer does not exist in the external environment. The correct answer originates exclusively inside your own skull. If the precise breakdown of your daily social mimicry unsettled you, if you felt a spike of cortisol watching this clinical reality, that means your executive function is still actively online. Subscribe to this channel. We will continue decoding the psychological architecture of your daily life. The truth is entirely clinical. It is brutally objective, and we are dissecting it here every single week.